Aye.
Commissioner, you may now begin.
Good afternoon. This is Roy Priest, the Chair of the Housing Opportunity Commission of Montgomery County. We start that again. Good afternoon. This is Roy Priest. I am the Chair of the Housing Opportunity Commission of Montgomery County. And I want to welcome you to this special session on Tuesday, October 25th. And it's called for the purpose of discussing our RFP procurement process. And the work session will be conducted by the staff, and the commissioners will in fact engage in the conversation as is appropriate and during the course of this conversation. So all of you all to this meeting. So we can proceed. I will turn the meeting over now to our Executive Director, Chelsea Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners, members of the public, and the HLC team. We're pleased to have a discussion with you all today as it pertains to our core values, specifically as it pertains to the property management RFP that will be moving forward, but also broadly as it pertains to how our commission and how we as an organization values our different components when evaluating potential responders to conduct business with. So as we go through this discussion, we anticipate us having open dialogue. This is part one of a two-part series. So the thought is that today you will hear staff recommendations, have an opportunity to share thoughts and feedback, and we'll walk through some of the slides that outlines how we'll move forward today. But we're really looking forward to an engaging discussion. And although we have a couple of hours blocked, I do want to give a preview and say we do have a moment in time where we will ask if there's a desire to have a break. And so, thank you. Next slide. And so again, welcome. The method in which we'll walk through the presentation today is multi-pronged. We'll start with essentially going through some key questions related to core values. I'll explain what the process is and how we'll seek alignment and feedback from you all. I'll highlight and provide clarity in regards to what we'll focus on in this session versus the second session. And then we'll talk about overarching rationale for our core values. We'll get into the core value discussion and then ultimately transition into a discussion that would reflect how the scoring equates to our core values and the weighting thereof. And then we'll talk about next steps. Next slide. So there are two key questions that are posed here today. The first is, what are the core values that HOC will use to evaluate possible property management companies and in other types of HOC procurements? And then the second question is, how should the core values for property management services be scored in the evaluation process? And again, I just want to emphasize that it's the hope of the staff that through these discussions, we're able to get a sense from the commission as it pertains to value orientation, which will help inform our other procurement efforts as well. Next slide. So the process today, I'm joined by multiple teammates who will help us walk through each of the core values for you and our recommendations and the rationale for the core values. We will go through a consensus-driven kind of approach so that we don't end up spending too much time debating any topic that we're in alignment on. We'll just kind of do a soft poll. Are there any challenges with us moving forward? And only where there's areas where it feels as though there's a potential majority of those who have concerns or issues will we pause and delve into further discussion. Of course, this is fluid, but the hope is that we don't get stuck on slide one because these are pretty dense topics, and I'm just trying to see where we have areas that we want to focus in on. And so really a consensus-driven approach. So you may hear me ask questions like, do we agree and support with these concepts? This is not a formal vote. this is definitely something that we're just utilizing to help facilitate us moving forward in discussion. Only when we get to a more formal process in the future would we be seeking a roll call vote on the overall core values or figuring out the best way to memorialize your consensus. And next slide. So we've broken this into 2 different sessions. I've shared with some of my team members that I'm overly optimistic. We might have so much success today that we don't need a part 2, but we have planned for a part 2, and today we plan to present to the commissioners really what the different core values and scoring metrics that are being proposed for property management contracts, what we've used in the past, gain an understanding of those core values, and then ultimately receive your feedback, have an opportunity to take that feedback and allow it to be reflected in an overall formal recommendation that would come back to the commission. Next slide. And so just starting with understanding the main goals of a revised RFP. As the commission knows, we really do rely heavily on our third-party property management companies to provide service to our properties and to our residents. And it's an extremely important part of our business. And so in looking at how we procure those services with a keen eye towards ensuring that those procurements reflect our values and that we are ensuring that we have the best fit services for each of our properties, as a commission, there was a desire to look at our RFP and have an opportunity to refresh it. And so that's what this exercise is. So the goal is to create as many objective data points as possible to try to remove subjectivity from the procurement process, create some clear minimum threshold evaluations that we would have for each of the respondents, and you'll hear more about that shortly, as well as ensure that we have in our core values and in our procurements that the core values are clear, precise, and consistent with the overarching goals of the commission. And you'll hear what some of those proposed core values are. And last but not least, because we have such a diverse portfolio, it is important, staff submits that it's important that our RFP respondents are able to identify how their services would best fit each of our particular properties that they're interested in providing service for. Next slide. And so the first question that we will walk through, and so you'll hear each of the staff walk us through these various core values, is does this properly reflect, do these 6 core values properly reflect the core values of the organization? And we will poll the question. I'll poll the question after we get through them all to kind of see, are there any other core values that we should consider? But I want you to have an opportunity to hear the background and the rationale for these values that are being presented to you today. Yes.
Madam Executive Director, before we get into the details, could I just request that in the future we get these briefing materials in advance, at least 24 hours?
Yes, and
rather than being caught cold with.
well, and I will say that, and I appreciate that recommendation. One of the things I wanted to make sure that we did today was to be able to provide context and to not go down a path where you have the materials and you're drawing conclusions that you really didn't have that background. That's why we did the part 2, but we will definitely provide materials further in advance since that's your desire. But it was a bit of a strategy to ensure that we had your attention today, that we had a chance to answer questions and get your feedback. Of course, even between now and the next session, if there are follow-up questions, we'll have a chance to respond to. And so then the first area that you'll hear about.
Excuse me, Chelsea, before you proceed, I'm sorry. I just made a little, I think, faux pas here, is that I did not introduce the members of the commission who are present, because we are present both in person and hybrid. And so I want to make sure that myself, Ward Priest, and also Commissioner Nelson are participating remotely. And present in the office for this presentation are Vice Chair, I see Frank Kelleher, Commissioner Perkowitz, and Commissioner Simon. So there are 5 commissioners currently present as part of this deliberation of the 7 members of our commission. So with that, let's go ahead and proceed. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question is what the core values, and this is a presentation again from staff, so it's really for you to digest and hear what our proposal would be to the commission for you to digest and share your thoughts. But you'll hear presentations related to minimum qualifications, experience and qualifications, current and past performance, proposed property plans, management fees and vendor costs, and MFD participation. You'll note that most of these elements are already included in one capacity or another in our RFPs. Where there is a difference and/or addition, we've used blue font. And so just to highlight those when we go through that area of the presentation, you will hear where we've either made a modification or a recommendation to add something new. And so the next slide also is a reference guide that we will be able to go back to as needed, but it allows for you to clearly see the difference between our current proposed core values and the prior core values. Again, of course, with these types of procurements, there's some consistency in terms of what we're looking for, but there are some modifications that are being recommended by staff, and you'll hear those reflected today. And you'll see how they represent what we believe to be in the best interest of us finding the best fit for our different property services. So next slide. Minimum qualifications. And so I do want to note that minimum qualifications as well as financial viability are standard evaluations in the procurement world. And so this element is one in which in all of our procurements there's typically a minimum qualifications evaluation. And in this circumstance, I'm going to turn it over to our procurement officer as well as and I don't see if Tim is on today, but our acting CFO. He might not be pinned on our screen, but I'll be turning it over to Lady Reyes to walk us through the process that we're proposing here for minimum qualifications.
Good morning, everyone. As stated, my name is Lady Reyes, and I am the procurement officer. So the core value of minimum qualifications, including the financial viability and experience requirements, are practices that are standard in the procurement arena. The goal of the minimum qualifications core value is to have a set of concrete and measurable qualifications that are required for a respondent's application and will objectively determine whether a response should receive further consideration. The minimum qualification of responsiveness will look at whether all of the essentials requirements of the RFP were met and whether the respondent provided all of the information in the format and order requested. The minimum qualifications including the experience requirements adapted will be specific to the type of property and will be versatile, as we recognize that it's not a one-size-fits-all. So all of the RFP will have specific requirements to the type of property. For example, it would read a minimum of X number of years, continuous experience in property management, managing affordable and market rate components similar to the property and is as described herein. We will also do the same in terms of when we are looking at the number of units that the property for which we are soliciting services requires. Any questions?
Yes, I do. normally in these type of procurements, under the minimum qualifications, which are those things that you have to go through before you are allowed to move to the next level review, are usually defined to looking at one, all the materials provided that were required by the RFP, and secondly, with the documents submitted on time, consistent with the commission deadline that was applied for. You added in minimum experience and financial viability that were not in previous RFPs. And now, it seems to me that what you are doing, I want to understand really why this is being imposed as a threshold requirement, when also there's a section that falls behind that deals with experience and also deals with matters dealing with financing. So why are you, this seems to be to me, and I also want to know who is going to be doing this threshold evaluation.
So the minimum here, we're looking at years of experience. So for example, we may say that the firm may have 3 years of experience managing a property. So they have to provide as the minimum qualifications proof that they have met that threshold.
Okay, so you delineate that test that you're applying at the very beginning to what is it that you are going to look at in the section dealing with experience?
Later on, we will discuss more in details of what the experience in that section will focus. This is more related to, we want to ensure that a firm has the minimum years of experience. So this is more specific, ensuring that they're able to meet that number of years.
And so,
Experience looks at different areas.
I understand that point you're making. I'm just wondering whether or not that should be a threshold requirement under the minimum qualifications to proceed, whether the application proceed to be fairly evaluated. I still want to know who's going to do the initial threshold review.
The initial review will be done by the procurement office. The responsiveness check will be done by the procurement office.
let me indicate this. So there's no decision yet on these qualifications. This is staff recommendation to the commission for an opportunity for feedback. So there's an opportunity to hear from the commission on, is this an area that you think we should keep? Is this an area that you think we should not maintain? But it is proposing what we believe to be 2 additional criteria that would help inform if a respondent should even proceed in the process. So setting a minimum threshold of experience so that someone who is just starting their business isn't selected to manage one of our very large properties that requires years of proven experience is something that we think there's a value. The financial viability component is also something that is common in the procurement space, and especially in this day and age, one of the areas that we had a concern about was how do we ensure that a company that would be responsible for the day-to-day oversight of our properties is not in a financial situation that could ultimately result in us not having proper coverage for those properties and not having a plan in which we'd be able to take over and manage those properties. So if a company unfortunately dissolved or changed hands or closed their doors, and we had an opportunity at the beginning of the procurement process to even get a pulse check on their financial strength, we'd want to do that level of due diligence, considering, again, how large of an impact that would be on our organization, us not having the staffing capacity to assist or to even address those situations. So those were 2 additional areas that are being proposed. The goal here is for us to hear your thoughts and feedback. And so please share, your thoughts on if this is something you would like to see, if you have concerns, and then we'll make notes and then we'll keep moving. But the goal is for us to get your reactions to some of these thoughts. And I see Commissioner Kelleher's hand is up, but I do want to make sure that we've answered Commissioner Priest before we move on to Commissioner Kelleher. If you had any additional follow-up to your question.
No, I guess your response makes me wonder how you want us to participate in this conversation. Because I was simply just stating what I thought were my concerns about these two areas. And so,
I think,
and asking questions about that, I'm not sure how you want to have this conversation go on then.
Well, if I may be able to provide some clarity, and this is Tim Getzinger, I'm the Chief Development Funds Officer and acting CFO. So in terms of the financial viability piece, what we're asking for and proposing for your consideration is to add a certificate of financial liability. This is not an analysis of the company, but they would have to provide a statement of financial position, such as a balance sheet, the results of operations, such as an income statement, as well as the past 3 audited annual financial reports. And they would also be certifying that they are not subject to any bankruptcy, concurrent bankruptcies, reorganizations, or any kind of insolvency proceedings. Additionally, they would also state that they have not been subject to any bankruptcy for the past 10 years, and that they are not into any crediting procedures as well. So it's really a certification in which the principal of the offer would be certifying to these standards. And again, we did ask around to make sure that we were reflecting what best practices were and what other organizations and units were doing.
So can I assume by that you would be specifying that in the RFP document specifically what you're looking for?
Exactly.
This is very generalized statement here.
yeah, I think,
That is correct. It would also be if any of these things were to happen within X number of days, call it 30 days, they would need to notify us in writing. It's something similar that all of our banks require. If there's any change in financial viability, we must notify them within 30 days, or we're in default of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
I think,
Other,
Roy, I was just gonna, I mean, in clarification, I think, for the point you were making about, experience here and experience elsewhere in the proposal, if I'm understanding this correctly, sort of the minimum qualifications are sort of just an initial hurdle, and in terms of process, like, if they don't meet the minimum qualifications, we're not gonna bother even spending time on the rest of the application. Is that accurate? Yeah.
That is correct, and there is a difference between experience here. Here is just demonstrating that there's a baseline of years of experience before you manage our portfolio. The experience section, which you'll hear a more detailed presentation on, will have more specifics. It might be LIHTC experience, it might be experience with senior properties, it depends, and you'll hear that in the experience section of the presentation. And then, Commissioner Priest, I do want to respond. My response to you is more just to make sure that in ladies' response and staff's response, that we're always indicating that these are proposals. And so, yes, your questions, your feedback, your thoughts are all informative and will help us fine-tune where we move forward and what we present to you ultimately. But just wanted to make sure that we made that very clear. And Commissioner Kelleher, apologize, I know your hand was up.
That's okay. I knew that he wanted to follow up on Roy's question, so I think that was appropriate. My bigger concern is these aren't values. When you look at the definition of values, it's the importance, worth, usefulness, judgment as to what's important, consider something to be beneficial, high opinion. I think if we were to think about what I've been thinking about in preparation for this meeting is totally different than the content for this agenda. It's more, what are the primary values that we would want to build eligibility requirements or performance metrics around? And this seems to be a mix of eligibility requirements and then the discussion going into performance metrics, which are important. You have to know how you're going to measure and evaluate the requirements. But for me, the values are things like safety, respect, stability, things like that that we need to decide. And then within those categories, decide what are the requirements that we're going to have for performance? What are the task-oriented things we're going to require as work from these entities? And how are we going to measure their performance quantitatively against that to evaluate them at the end of a contract year or decide whether to open them up again? So I think we've kind of jumped into the weeds and aren't dealing with values here.
Well, I'd love to hear other commissioners' thoughts. The way that we have looked at this and the way I am presenting it to the commission is what I do believe reflective of values. When we're thinking about what we want in terms of a property management company to provide services, it might be we value them being able to demonstrate that they collect their rents on time and that they're responsive to customer complaints and that they have a high level of compliance in their divisions and in their apartments. It might be that we want to add additional points and or incentives around MFD businesses, and that's a reflection of the agency's values in terms of where it wants to pursue procurement. I'd love to hear more about your recommendation related to those values and how that would reflect in a quantifiable, objective RFP. And so if there's a desire to have further discussion on that, we can pause. But in terms of how we move forward with an RFP process, the way that these values would reflect in terms of where the commission thinks different things are important would be reflected in what's showing up here on the list, as well as how you score these different components, which would ultimately demonstrate where your value orientation is on these different elements. And so I would pause and ask for any additional thoughts or response or even further elaboration. And I see Commissioner Simon's hand.
I think this is a very key element, and there has been history of us questioning some of the criteria and appropriateness of, or were there certain questions asked. But it had been my hope and my thought and anticipation was more parallel to that of Commissioner Cullihart. I think it's been a long time since this agency has sat down and said, let's look at our mission again. Is it articulated appropriately? Are the criteria in the mission measurable? How do we evaluate them? Do we want to change any of those basic views of our agency and our task, since it's been a long time since, at least it's been as long as I've been here, that we've not had a conversation about the role of the agency, our forward-looking, and I was hoping that we would have that discussion first and then talk about the components and approaches that the various departments in implementing would fulfill and measure and evaluate the work of each of the departments. This, I think, is a very valuable process. I just had anticipated an earlier step that was broader in focus. I guess is the best way to put it.
If I could for a moment, Chelsea, excuse me, Ms. Andrew, say something. I think that let's not get hung up on the word core values in a way. Because the fact that what you're suggesting, Mr. Simon, is something that will be certainly a major part of our strategic planning process.
Yeah.
Those are the typical things you see, kind of discussions, when you talk about broad visions and mission and objectives and those kind of things. That is what the strategic plan process will in fact address. We got into this discussion around the RFP because we were looking at property management procurement. And so we were just trying to really isolate this one sort of area of saying, well, how do these commissioners want to take a look at how we manage our RFP process. That's stepping a little bit away from the value-centered conversation, which is more related to our strategic planning process. And that is something that we are going to be able to do. But if you see that as a prerequisite before we can talk about a isolated situation with the RFP, then that's a different whole piece, that's a different way to approach all of this.
Could I follow up? I don't necessarily feel it's a prerequisite to developing an RFP template. I think any more than it's a strategic plan is a prerequisite to everything, but that's what I came prepared to talk about, not to see this. I mean, I think we can talk about eligibility requirements and performance requirements, and then what metrics we would use to evaluate them and measure them. I think that's important. It's just not what I thought we were going to be doing.
I'm wondering, Commissioner Keller, if some of what you're talking about would be like the components of these different criteria. So, if safety, use safety as an example, whether either as a separate criteria or safety record, or if that is built into experience and qualifications in some ways, or built in through or the proposed property plan. So I'm wondering if...
I think they're highly related. I think of it more as a waterfall. You start with safety, and then you go to security of persons and property, free from threat from fire, water, and pest. And then what requirements do we put on the vendor to fulfill that on our behalf to our residents? Radon, carbon monoxide, and lead abatement, kinds of things versus, pest abatement, whatever. In effectiveness and stability, I think, is where you would come up with the financial viability requirement. You would also have cost effectiveness. You would have a lot of issues there that could end up being requirements in an RFP. Those type are very easy to quantify and measure compared to, say, respectful, where you would want to have information about how they were interacting with residents, what residents' views of the vendor were as feedback on a survey that they were all subjected to. Those kinds of things. So some are easy to fall out and have tasks written about and have metrics about. Others are more difficult.
And I can clearly see where, because of the title is core value, okay, we clearly see that I would anticipate the kind of conversation you're talking about, Commissioner Keller, and also Commissioner Simon. I appreciate, respect that, and we will definitely get to that conversation very quickly. Right now, I think what we're trying to focus in on just really are, what are the evaluation factors that we use to assess a submission that's submitted by a vendor in response to an RFP for property management. So it's much more narrow objective, I think. And if I'm off base here, please correct me, staff.
But let me say that in the discussions we had leading up to this meeting, I believe, Chelsea, you said that one of the things we want to do is make sure that our vendors are in fact reflecting our core values. And what I'm not seeing here, and I think this is the way to get to what Commissioner Keller is saying, is overall, what are we expecting from property management vis-a-vis our residents? I mean, I had expected that you would have a statement that says you're looking for somebody who has some experience in managing affordable and market rate and the combination of those, and is paying attention to the needs of all of the residents. Nowhere do we talk about that expectation. I mean, what we're one of the things we're looking for, what our mission is related to our residents.
Right, how do they know that we're,
The other question I have when I Laura is, in terms of these criteria, you say a minimum of X years of continuous experience. When do we determine how many years that is? And does that vary depending on property? What are the details of it from the website?
So there's I want to respond because I kind of anticipated that as we were going through this process that we might have areas where you have thoughts and feedback and where we can take your feedback and fine tune, right? So the conversation in regards to how we address strategic planning overall, that will be a larger conversation. We're trying to gear up for procurement that needs to happen at the beginning of next year. And so what we needed to do was to be able to present to you our best effort in terms of really refreshing our current RFP that's been used for many years to reflect what we've been hearing from the commission, and then delineating between how we approach an initial RFP to bring a company in and what we would do in terms of renewals. So a part of their contract will include many of these areas that you've identified if they are so selected, that would be areas that we would evaluate them on by way of survey or by way of feedback from our clients or by way of our own audit and evaluation of their services. And so that would, and you'll see in our recommendation, bear out as it pertains to us having an opportunity to determine if we should renew and managing those expectations from the beginning of what that would require of them throughout the course of their contract. I will just say that, of course, what we as staff have to do is balance the overarching strategic planning process that will take place in the future and then our day-to-day business that needs to take place between now and then. And so that's why we've presented these goals. What might be helpful, considering some of the feedback that we're hearing, is for you to just get a chance to digest what we've presented, for us to hear the kind of questions that you're raising, and then for us to have an opportunity. I did meet with both Commissioner Nelson and Commissioner Priest a while back to just kind of preview the approach here, but we can definitely take the feedback that we've received just to determine if there should be another approach. That's why we definitely created a second session. But I did want to afford an opportunity for you to hear our best thinking as it pertains to this specific RFP, where we've landed in terms of the type of experience and or qualifications that we believe would be what we would want to see for companies that we engage with. And then there definitely will be a host of other areas, thoughts, and suggestions that we anticipate hearing from you all today. And so I see your hand up, Commissioner Simon, but I would, of course, take your feedback and then hope that we do have a chance to share with you all the material.
I was going to suggest that obviously a lot of work has been put into this, and we know that the procurement process is something we want to look at, and I would suggest that we hear the presentation, and the fact that I came to the meeting with an inappropriate expectation should not interfere with our hearing the staff's thoughts about procurement, and we can put the other issue back in our pockets for another meeting. And but it would provide some opportunity for us to be prepared for the discussion that you and I, Fran, have a concern about, and we can always amend the procurement process again if it turns out that after some of those other discussions, we feel that we haven't incorporated some of those items into the procurement process as we'd like to have it. So I would propose that the staff be permitted to move forward, and we get the understanding of the procurement issue. I think the core value phrase perhaps is what misled me down the wrong path. And, but I'd be happy to hear how the staff looks at this element of the agency's core value.
Is that a consensus to move forward? I'm looking at the chair and making sure that I'm following your lead in regards to how you'd like us to move forward.
No, I mean, I totally agree with the expression by Commissioner Simon that this is really, as I was trying to say earlier, this is really about trying to look at the RFP procurement process. And the other things that are really important, really overarching important to us as commissioners, is looking at how we carry out and how we do our business on behalf of the clients we represent. And so I think that, and I think that's somewhat inherent in this procurement process as well, because this is trying to procure services, provide the best level of services to those residents and to our properties. So I think you go ahead and proceed.
Okay. And so on this slide, you see the new recommendations related to minimum experience and financial viability. I heard questions related to how many years. I also, we had Tim Getzinger explain how we would approach financial viability and how that would be very clear for the respondents in terms of what we'd be looking for. Before moving to the next slide, just want to ask if there are any follow-up questions or any other concerns related to this component.
I would just be saying that the two areas in the minimum qualifications that I think that I would truly support, the ones dealing with responsiveness, where we talk about the matter being both with providing the requested materials as well as timely submission. And I also agree with the idea about the financial viability, because those are also two areas where we don't ask about anywhere else in the other areas. Okay, we do have a separate item to deal with experience. So I have a little question about thinking the experience in minimum qualifications when we have it as a specific evaluation factor.
Question I would ask is, will we receive financial statements from some of these financial terms? I mean, I understand what you're getting to in terms of a certification of financial liability, but my guess is you take a large management firm and there's some hesitancy for them to provide HOC in financial statements.
Well,
And a lot of that too, Tim, on the next point, so a lot of things that we require that we treat confidentially. They're not made a part of, they're not foreseeable things, okay, because they do go to the specific respondent who may want to share that information with us. Just for public purposes, okay?
Well, I think that that's a very good point. This is something that is new, but we did speak to, again, other agencies, and this is a standard practice, and I think that potentially this could take some getting used to by our vendors, but we would be asking for financial statements such as balance sheet, income statement, and the last 3 years of audited financials, as we are currently.
Who's speaking?
Tim.
Okay, well, I think we've had the feedback on that. We can move on to just further discussion about that. We could move to the next slide.
Okay. I see Commissioner Kelleher's hand is up.
I reserve the right to send in responses once I've actually had time to think about this, since I'm one of the commissioners that was not privileged to have any information about this in advance. I would say that I think at a minimum, we have to have something about the number of appropriately trained staff and their capacity to staff up to the level that would be required to handle the volume of business that they are about to take on if they are awarded the RFP.
Thank you, Commissioner. And yes, you will see that also reflected in the slides. And absolutely, we welcome additional thoughts after today's session as well. So as we move on to the next slide, this is where we believe that respondents should be able to demonstrate that their experience and qualifications would make them best suitable for the property that they're pursuing in response to the RFP. As you all know, we have some transitionings happening in our property management division. So we have support today from our real estate division, who's also and has been a partner in this process as we've been going through reevaluating our RFP. So we will have both Zach as well as Marcus from our real estate division. Zach Marks, our Chief Real Estate Officer, and Marcus Irvin, our Director of Real Estate, assist us with this explanation.
I guess is the mic? All right. Good morning, good afternoon. Marcus Irvin for the record, Director of Real Estate. So in this, I'll say slides 11 through 14, Zach and I will be sort of trading off on these next few core values. And also within slide 12 and slide 14, there's going to be a prescribed template that will develop to accompany the points outlined here. However, in slide 11, as we discussed, this will get into more detail to determine whether the respondent has sufficient experience and qualifications to manage the proposed project. So some of the criteria proposed here would be demonstrated sufficient experience of its executive and on-site staff. So for example, that would be maintenance supervisor, senior property manager, assistant property manager, leasing consultant, et cetera, all which may evolve over the life cycle of the project if it is a new construction lease-up property. Respondent demonstrated sufficient experience in managing, and we have bracketed here, affordable, mixed income, low-income housing tax credit, Class A, which is a category of property, age-restricted properties, and also the housing choice voucher program. Third point, respondent makes an explicit connection between their general experience, which would go back to the earlier mention, and how it's applicable to this specific property. So once again, taking it from the high level in the very beginning and then down to the specific property. And to Commissioner Keller's point, so the capacity to staff that up and ensuring that the folks identified in the proposal are able to carry out the management of the property. And then lastly, respondent demonstrated experience working with nonprofits, public housing authorities, and/or governmental agencies.
Let me pause. I think we're having some technical difficulty, and I do want to make sure that both Commissioner Roy Priest and Commissioner Nelson are able to hear the presentation that was just provided by Marcus.
Yes, good.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you. And so the area that is new here is the blue area, the blue section that indicates that we want to ensure that the experience that they have either is directly related to the type of property that we are soliciting services for, or that they're able to draw the connection for us. And do that in a way that allows us to have a level of comfortability related to their experience and ability to move, to provide us with service. And we'll digest and allow a moment for digestion here and ask if there are any additional questions related to this section before we move on to the next, which will focus on current and past performance.
Just to use an example, for example, under the earlier slide, when talking about minimum qualifications, you were setting, without specifying a specific number of years experience with threshold. But here you go into responding to demonstrate sufficient experience with executive or study staff or blah, without speaking to affirmed experience. Okay, I mean, staff is claiming a part of the firm, but you know, you have set at a possible factor for eliminating even further reviews. They've got to have so many years of experience yet not reflected at all in your evaluation measurement criteria in this slide.
I would also like to add, unless it's more appropriate someplace further along, turnover time, their experience in how rapidly they turn over vacancies because I think that's one of the places that we have not been strong and could be much stronger.
That's a great point. We'll add that.
As
There
a
are-
measurement criteria.
There are some circumstances in which we're hybrid, where we provide the maintenance, and others where they do. But I could definitely, we've noted the file here, and especially if it's a property where they would provide the maintenance, that would be a good criteria. Let me make sure I understand your comment, Commissioner Priest. You're indicating that we should ask about number of years of experience for their executive staff and their on-site staff?
Yeah,
Yes, okay. And so definitely, I think a part of the plan was to ask for their staffing proposal, which would include bios and information related to who they would propose to staff. But I think the point that you've made is also something we could incorporate as well.
because you have this other criteria, which is on the proposed property plan. I know in that when you add the staffing plan, this review will be put in, which is a good idea. I thought the point that Mrs. Salmon made is an excellent point about unit turnaround experience is also very important to add also maybe to the property plan section as opposed to the experience section. So maybe it's both places.
Thank you.
I would add,
Also, since you mentioned later on in this, I will repeat Keller's comment that I had earlier. I don't know whether it's addressed later, but there's a couple of other areas that are of interest. Their experience in terms of rent collection, and responsiveness to tenant complaints, meaning the work orders and all that sort of stuff. We don't mention any of that.
You'll see that later in another component. Yes.
I would, if it's not covered elsewhere, add experience with customer satisfaction surveying.
That's an area that we definitely are looking forward to doing objectively across our portfolio as a measure of determining renewals. Many of our third-party partners have their own surveys as well. That, of course, allows for them to get the feedback, but we do want to make sure that we're getting our own feedback that we're able to use as the basis for the renewal process, and that's something that we will have in place before executing the contract, so that they also understand what those measures are that we'd be looking for.
Right, and we would need baseline data, because otherwise, if you wait until a year in to measure you with no baseline, the year one becomes baseline and you don't have a measure against. But just seeing whether they have experience supporting the process of that, I think, is worth checking.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, we need to have our survey done once before the beginning of their active management.
And I think we can discuss further. Some of the thought that I have is that we may want to consider a rolling survey when people are doing recertifications, because then that would allow us to not just have a snapshot in time, but to have over a course of time. But there's a lot of thought about the best way to approach it. As we all know, there's staff turnover, so on day one you might get surveyed, and there might be a property management manager there, and then by the 7th month, it could be someone else. And so I'm also trying to think about how do we ensure that the survey is reflective over the course of time, is fair, and allows for us to get good data. Also, if there is going to be a change in who is the property management company, at the beginning, it will be hard to get and do a baseline. But we can talk about it further, and I know that you have some expertise here, it appears, Commissioner Kelleher, so I will definitely follow up and get your suggestions and thoughts on how to proceed with the survey component. But we would not incorporate that in the original RFP because at this stage, they would be new, providing services to our residents.
But Chelsea, you keep focusing on renewal, but we've got cases where you have a manager who would be new to the property that we're going out for. And if we've had experience with them, we would want to know what their experience was in terms of tenant satisfaction on the other projects that doesn't seem to be covered by this. And also, if it's a brand new contractor, I'd like to know, to the extent that we can find out, how they can receive in terms of tenant satisfaction, whether it's their own or somebody else's evaluation. It's still something that you put into the mix as you consider it. You shouldn't wait for a 2-year period or however long that first initial management period is to test out whether they have any experience in being satisfactorily received by the tenant. I think there is something we can find out about that upfront.
I agree this needs a whole meeting in and of itself. I would just say that even if you're changing who the vendor is, having baseline is important. You don't know if they're improving, holding the same, or declining unless you have baseline from before the beginning of the contract period.
Welcome all the thoughts. There's definitely a lot to be said related to how we survey and how we approach this. The one thing that is a nuanced point, and we can have a separate, there's a group of commissioners who are specifically interested in this topic, and we can have further discussion. But one thing I will say, in terms of being fair to respondents, is that there are different levels of properties that different companies manage that also impact how their performance is. And so what we're trying to do is give a fair shot. Of course, looking at a company and some of these other objective criteria allow us to get an indication of their level of professionalism and ability to respond. But if someone was managing a property that might have been a troubled property with a lot of challenges in terms of maintenance versus a Class A property where everyone is doing just fine and has glossy floors and brand new facilities, you're going to have a difference of experience
That's
for
right.
those who respond.
And that's why baseline will show that.
You're absolutely correct, Commissioner Kelleher. And I think, again, we can have further discussion on how we create that survey, and if there's a strong sentiment of having one be a part of this, we could also talk about what happens if someone hasn't had that direct comparison in terms of the baseline for any other property that they provided services for us to look at in terms of determining how well they would perform at that property. So we can move on and discuss further.
One point on the blue area where respondent makes an explicit connection between their general experience and how it's applicable to the property. I like what it says, but I don't know what it means.
So one of the considerations here and what we're trying to do is if we're promoting or seeking responses to a senior property, for example, wanting to ensure that the respondent is clear that they either have that type of experience in servicing that type of property and clientele and can think through some of the challenges, issues, and how they would respond to those and provide that level of service that we'd want in that type of property, or that they're able to connect their own experience and say, while I might not have had a senior property in the past, we've had this type of property, and this is how we would approach a senior property to allow us to understand that they understand that there are nuances with managing a senior property versus a family property, a high-rise versus a property that spans a large area that might require a different level of attention and a different level of engagement. And so the hope is
scattered site is an entirely different kettle of fish.
absolutely. And so the thought is that they'd be able to draw that connection for us versus us having to be subjective and drawing those connections ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think what you gotta do is refine it in such a way that the respondent will know what you're asking for here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, that explicit connection, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Just saying it on paper, can you think about something like relationship building or customer service? Like, I'm like Roy, that doesn't come across as understandable when you read it.
Okay, and so we will, move on. I guess I'm not following the relationship building component. I think what we were looking for was experience with that type of property, but if the way that this is worded isn't clear, we'll go back and refine and try to make sure that it's clearer for the second go-round before the commission and see if it meets muster. And so we'll move on to current and past performance.
Okay. Once again, Mark Servin. So slide 12 is one in which we would have we've noted here that we have a template to be completed by each of the respondents. This would be to better understand the respondents' actual performance on comparable properties using specific data points. And some of these key performance metrics, as highlighted in blue, would be for the last 5 years for projects similar to the property that they're submitting a proposal for, which would include the submarket, the size of the property, the type, et cetera, some of the data points from the prior slide. And also including but not limited to these areas, including rent charges versus collection history, occupancy, which we sustained occupancy, and some of this may be proprietary, so the template would provide a way for them to enter in this information. Debt service coverage ratio, aged accounts receivable, and a overall narrative option to explain any issues or discrepancies with their numbers.
What are they going to do on debt service? I'm not sure I understand their role in the DLC.
So typically a property that may be in new construction and converting to a permanent mortgage is going to have a minimum debt service coverage ratio. So we'd like for them to identify, what the minimum was for that property and what they achieved. I think that's an important performance metric that will speak to lease up and stabilize operations at the property.
So would that only apply to a subset of properties that one might bid on?
I think it depends on on what they're submitting the response to, but we would have it in there as a metric and part of their experience. They could not easily, but within the template sheet, put in there what that minimum was and what was achieved during that period of time. But this is a suggestion at this point.
But I guess the minimum debt service coverage is a function of the developer or the end or the owner of the property. And if you start having an unreasonably low or high debt service coverage, then the property manager is not going to be able to have any impact on that. It doesn't seem to fit in this kind of stuff. And do we currently hold managers responsible for meeting our debt service coverage?
It's not something that we typically look at now. That's something that in the discussions that staff had, we felt it was important to include because we felt it was frankly an omission. Debt service coverage ratios will not play the same role on each property, but each of the different sorts of properties, whether it's a renovation, a tax credit deal, new construction, or simply an operating property, the debt service coverage ratio is important to everything all the way up to HOC's GO capacity. So it's not something that we as a staff we felt put enough emphasis on. So we've included it here because at the end of the day, the property manager is certainly not going to have any impact on the original debt raised that we're now using as part of the ratio, but everything else is revenue and expenses. So it's not so much that we'll blame them 100%. It's all their fault if revenues, expenses go the wrong way. But certainly that we want them to be mindful that it's extremely important to our agency's ability to do additional business. So we wanted to make it, in the spirit of getting things out in front on the table, we decided to include it.
Did they
I
have any?
agree with that, and I think the language should be revenue and expenses, not debt service coverage.
I would add that it is debt service coverage, this is Q.E. Brown speaking, because in most of our transactions, debt service is fixed.
You're breaking up.
I would say it is debt service coverage because, as we've stated to you before, in most of our transactions, the debt service is fixed. And so it's all three components. It's the revenue boost, it's the controlling the expenses, and because the debt service is fixed, that's one metric that you have to look at in the end. And so I think it's important because it reflects their ability to manage our revenues and expenses.
I think that's a reasonable consideration. The question goes on whether or not that is a typical kind of factor that the property management companies track as opposed to a financing, certainly a major financing underwriting consideration. But whether or not we would get a responsiveness from a potential property management company for this area, I would question that, okay? I understand why you ought to want that, but I just don't know that we should include it here.
Not sure if this is the place for it or not, but since we're talking about collections, I'm wondering, is there a place in here for collection practices? So, especially when we think about values, for me, I mean, it is important, obviously, that we are collecting rents, but that whoever is collecting them on our behalf is also doing it in a responsible and respectful way.
It's not reflected here, but I have made the note, and I think one of the ways we could also ensure that that happens is by incorporating kind of our policies, procedures, requirements in the contract. But I agree, and thank you for raising that.
I would like to also suggest, again, not sure where it belongs, but the issue of fair housing and fair housing training. And I think that there needs to be a significant awareness of the need for that to be a continuing kind of obligatory training. So I would hope that all we need to do is read the front page of the Post to understand the significance of that.
Absolutely, thank you, and I'll also, of course, look to our legal counsel in terms of other training obligations that any contractor with us also has to maintain, but thinking about how we can ensure that compliance with the training is also something that we can verify along the way would be great, so thank you. If there are no further questions on current and past performance, as you can see, our goal here is to really try to be as objective as possible so that we're able to kind of compare respondents and their responses. We'll move now to the proposed property plan. This is a new element. This is really driven from the experience from our staff in terms of as we've assessed what's worked and what hasn't worked and what could have potentially resulted in best fits for our properties, wanting to ensure that we have an opportunity to hear very clearly how a respondent would provide their service to our property, and I'll pass it back over to Marcus and Zach.
Okay. So the goal of the proposed property plan would be to gain a deeper understanding of how each respondent would manage the specific property if they were selected. Many RFP responses are general in nature, and we want a better understanding who we are partnering with and what their plans are for our communities and customers. So if we were to sort of connect the dots with slides 11 and 12 and now the 13, sort of beginning at the sort of experience and qualifications, the experience of the staff, we can also look at training. Now we're drilling down into current and past performance. Now we're getting down to the level of sort of granular detail at the property, how they plan to implement this. So the measurement criteria, quality of and detail in the following plans submitted to HOC as part of the RFP submission We do have an asterisk here regarding past practice. So this would include pre-leasing and marketing plans. So for a new construction sort of lease up, we have this as a request. Also the management plan, the maintenance plan, subcontracting plan, and then also the staffing plan. So once again, connecting the folks who are going to be on the ground and how this is measured in this proposed property plan. And we also have a note here that the property plan should not be a one-size-fits-all. It should be tailored to the relevant property. So for example, if the property is a senior or age-restricted, the plans need to be responsive to the issues at that property.
I can't see anyone else. I would say this is going to put a responsibility on the staff to provide a template for a specific property. For example, you got to talk about the age of your major systems, for example. Is it a new building, the existing building, how old is it, what's the system, and then what are the major investments we made in the property. Man, I'm going to respond to this. I'm going to be giving you a plan. I want to know what I'm dealing with, okay? Because if you've got a really antiquated infrastructure, this building is going to have a different requirement for me in terms of maintenance plan. So I'm just saying there's got to be some basic information that you as staff are going to provide to a potential respondent about this big property. If you want this level of detail.
That's a good point. The other thing I do want to indicate is we have asked for property plans in the past. They just weren't scored. But I think you're right, and we'll make note of essentially the key elements of the property that we need to provide with the RFP so that the companies know what they're responding to and what the needs of that particular property would be.
I would add to that if there are any particular resident types or programs at a property that we would need to provide that information to. For example, is this have property-based vouchers? Does this have a program for supportive housing? Does this, there's a lot that makes a difference there as well that we would want to provide them in order to get helpful and meaningful responses.
Okay. Hearing no additional comments, we'll move on to management fee and vendor costs.
Okay. I think I have one here as a, this one will also be a, should I have a template for that one? Yeah, this one is one we're also contemplating a template for. So the goal here would be to get a clear sense of all costs and fees that the respondent would charge if awarded the contract, criteria outlined, price per unit, management fee amount, reimbursable expenses, vendor services with hourly and overtime rates, capital project management fees. We can also move this one up, but per unit cost as a percentage, we can tie that with number one. And any proposed fees to HOC or bonuses to staff for the pre-leasing period or the general marketing efforts.
There's one thing that on the previous slide, which you included requirements for the staffing plan under the property proposal, which is good, I like that. But also under the issue around management fees, a lot has to do with, again, staffing. Who are they going, what staff are they going to employ in this property? Are they using journeymen, are they using laborers? I mean, who are they using? Because that factors all into, to me, the budget. What you're asking for. How do you construct that fee, management fee?
Okay.
Thank you. We'll make a note of that. And let's move on to the next slide. This element relates to minority, female, disabled participation, the acronym that's used in the county to attract minority, female, and disabled businesses. to have opportunities for contracting. And so, based on the prior direction of the commission, and consistent with our current procurement policy, we are proposing points for MFD firms, and the way that we'll measure that is multiple potential criteria, MFD certification, if they meet the criteria of a joint venture between MFDs and non-MFDs, and that is a practice that's standard in procurements, subcontracting to MFDs, MFD-focused recruitment, training, and leadership programs, wages paid to MFDs, and self-performance by MFDs. Pardon me. This is an area in which, again, we have provided points in the past, but we want to ensure that we keep in this next round of procurement. And it can get pretty detail oriented. We've gone through quite an exercise of evaluating best practices in evaluating MFD companies, and the goal here is essentially to ensure that we award points to companies that can either demonstrate that they are a MFD company and or majority owned MFD joint venture, or have a substantial amount of their subcontracting to MFDs. So really just trying again to emphasize the importance here. We will continue to fine tune what that looks like to present in more detail, but wanted to put this forward and ensure that this is a core value that the commission wants us to continue to pursue.
One thing I would ask on this point is that throughout this whole document, there is a total omission of any requirement related to the applicability of Section 3. And that's a requirement that HUD requires of agencies that receive funding from HUD, that they have a Section 3 plan.
Yes.
And it would seem to me that there's no reference in this document at all to Section 3 and the engagement of residents, either through employment or training or anything else from anybody who is getting a contract. So where do we intend to include Section 3 in this procurement process?
And so that is a requirement for a respondent to demonstrate that they will meet Section 3 requirements, but it's not an element in which we're scoring or providing additional points for. It's a prerequisite and a requirement that's set out in both the procurement for them to provide their Section 3 plan, and then it's a requirement that's also reflected in their contract and that we have ongoing compliance and monitoring of. It's one of the areas also that we will look to when we think about renewals and ensuring that there was compliance or that they satisfied their Section 3 obligations. And so it's not identified here as explicitly, but it is a part of the requirements. They don't receive extra points because it is a prerequisite to entering into a contract and to participating in receiving funds from HOC.
Would it then be under minimum qualifications, number one?
Yes, because it'd be, thank you, Commissioner Kelleher, it'd be something that they're required to also submit as a part of the overall RFP response. And so their Section 3 response would be included, and if it were not, they would not meet the minimum threshold to move forward in the process.
Thank you.
Is there a minimum that they have to meet to get any points?
Pardon, is there a minimum for Section 3? I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, for this particular section, MFD participation.
Yes, and in fact, in a few slides, we're going to move to looking at scoring, and then you'll have an opportunity to weigh in on if our current allocation of scoring is reflective of how the commission would weight these different criteria.
The other question, maybe you'll address it later on, is one, I thought there was an opportunity for them to show that the staff that they have, their staff that they have assigned, even though they're not an MFD firm, the staff they have assigned are a minority. Does that give them some points? And I think particularly in the terms of some of the grant firms you've had, they have shown how some of their major actors really are minorities.
That's an interesting point, and I would say that that's something we can discuss larger as a commission, because that would tie really to organization demonstrating their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which isn't directly what we're focused on here with this MFD. That's something that I would love for us to have further discussion on, especially as we go through the strategic planning process. But with the county, in terms of us mirroring the policy of MFD, and I'll also look to some of my other subject matter experts who spend a great deal of time with the MFD process, looking at the employees or the diversity of the employees would not necessarily warrant a company having MFD qualification. Their subcontracting, however, if they subcontract to MFD firms, would ultimately lean towards potential points. But as we talk through and think about our strategic plan and how we want to promote diversity, thinking about requiring diversity elements and components for a company in their staffing, their board, other areas that we could explore, that's definitely something we could discuss further, but it's not reflected in the MFD participation.
I think, however, this component helps an awareness of this and a measurement of this says something about the firm and whether their core values are consistent with ours, and allows an identification with the population that we serve. And to me, it's critical there, because the ability to interact with our tenant population, if there is some reflection in the management companies employ, for them to be able to identify, empathize, and respectfully serve our residents. And I think that issue, it goes back to the fair housing issue and how it has to be maintenance personnel, clerical personnel, management personnel. Those have to be overarching identifications, and empathy and understanding and cultural understanding as well. And it's very hard to measure that, I understand, but there needs to be some measurable reflection of the population with whom they are working. So I think it's a tough nut to articulate and work into standards, but I think it's something we really need to be sensitive to.
We addressed this in some respects with the, if I'm correct, with the mortgage finance and the banking RFPs that we put out. Because we've asked in those particular RFPs, if I remember correctly, for them to identify the minority
Deposits.
status of their leadership and the minority status of folks that are working on projects.
And the location of their branches and so forth.
So, I mean, there is some way that we've done it in some RFPs. So it's not something that, I don't know how we handle it, but it's something that we need to look at.
It's funny, this discussion is a little bit timely, and I won't belabor it, but Jennifer and I are currently working on an RFP for bond underwriters, and the discussion that you'll see in just a minute just could not apply, but we're asking each firm to submit their EEO plans for the organization as a whole, so we can see their history of how they're meeting race equity and social justice initiatives as a firm. And then for members of the team, we're asking them to show the makeup of the team, and so we can evaluate how they're aiming or actually achieving, meeting racial equity across the board. So you'll see
And their
that when it
CRA.
yes,
be
that as
measured
well.
and
That's part of the evaluation. So you'll see that later on when it comes forward. But yeah, very good discussion.
But that, the time that you were talking about when we did it.
And so I think just hearing from Kayreen in terms of how we're approaching it elsewhere and hearing the feedback from the commission, thinking about how we could potentially incorporate those elements here, and if so, would they be additional points that we'd want to add and/or elements that we'd want to add? And so making a note of that, and also looking forward to hearing from the commission if you'd want that to be reflected as a separate and apart goal, where there would be potentially additional points awarded based on a demonstration of diversity and what that threshold would need to reflect.
I think that would be moving in the right direction, because at a point in time where MFD certification process was put in place was far prior to really the current focus around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that as we move forward with anything that we do, we should be around understanding how that should be shaped in terms of the way we carry out our procurement, other policies, agencies that they relate to all of this diversity, equity, and inclusion consideration.
Excellent feedback. And so we've made a note of that. This is where, next slide, we wanted to afford an opportunity for an optional recess. Oh, excuse me, I've skipped over. Let me wrap us up. This poll is really, again, not a firm vote, but an opportunity to hear where we would potentially need to focus more attention. I think I'll move us past this slide. I think the goal was initially for us to walk you through all of the information, and then we'd get a readiness one way or the other. But I feel like we've gotten feedback throughout the course of the presentation. And I'll just pause to say, are there, now that you've heard all of the different components, are there other areas that, and we have the note on the EEO and the feedback that we've received throughout, but any other thoughts, feedback that you'd like us to take back to reconsider and or elaborate on? Yes, Commissioner Keller.
I would think you would want a clear definition of the tasks and competencies that we are hiring them for. And then the experience and qualifications would be measured against, at least in part, those tasks and competencies. It's hard for me to tell the difference between number 2, experience and qualifications, and number 3, current and past performance, because to me, current and past performance is your experience. But against what? What exactly are we hiring these people to do?
And so Commissioner Kelleher, with these RFPs, because of course, the goal today is not to present the full RFP with all the language that is typically incorporated therein. But when you have an RFP, you do outline and are very specific in regards to what you're seeking services for and the purpose and why and for what particular properties. So we would definitely have that level of detail in the initial RFP that outlines what we're seeking. In terms of answering the question about the difference between 2 and 3, just to recap, because that's a great point, and I think it's one that's worthy of reevaluating. In 2, when we talk about experience, this is the area where they have more opportunity to provide a narrative response. It's more elaborative, where they have an opportunity to share what their years of experience has yielded, the type of properties they've covered, maybe even provide numbers in terms of the number of properties and throughout what parts of the county or even elsewhere. So it's more of an opportunity for them to demonstrate who they are, their ability to partner or work with nonprofits, or their past experience working with government entities, or their focus on affordable housing. And so it is a much larger space and place for them to elaborate. Then the next area, the current and past performance, is more objective and focused on data points. And so when we say we want to be able to evaluate your key performance metrics over the last 5 years, and we say 5 years, of course, open to feedback from the commission on if that's an appropriate range, but that's where we look at those objective criteria, the rent charges versus collection history, the occupancies, the debt service, those areas that we went through. So one being more open and narrative and an opportunity to understand who is responding and what their experience is, and then the second focusing more so on really looking objectively at how their performance has yielded at various properties that they've managed in the past.
I have a question, please, Commissioner Byrd. Number 4, the proposed property plan, is that just the property plan, or are we including any of the other plans that Marcus went over on the previous slide, where it had the maintenance plan? Can't remember everything from the slide.
Let's go back to slide 13. Thank you, Commissioner
Yeah,
Byrd.
that was it. So are we just limited to just the property plan, or is it encompassing these other plans here?
Yes, and so what we'd be seeking from respondents is a clear plan in terms of how they will support our property, including but not limited to the areas that are identified here on the slide. So they would have to demonstrate how they will approach pre-leasing and marketing our property.
Okay.
Yes, all of these elements would be incorporated in their proposed property plan.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
In the evaluation plan, where you're going to evaluate responses on this area dealing with experience, would awarding of points be where a firm who had 25 years experience get more points than a firm that had 5?
I think, it's going to be, of course, the panel would be briefed on what we're looking for in a pre-prep meeting before reviewing proposals. But one would assume that if you had 25 years of experience, then you would be able to demonstrate a high level of experience in the field. But one, if your experience isn't directly related to the type of property, then this is an area where it's, of course, there's some level of subjectivity, and the reviewer would have to look at overall, what did you present in terms of your ability and your experience. This is why we've tried to balance out some objectivity in the following criteria. But one might say that, of course, if you've been in the business for a long period of time, then you're able to demonstrate more years of experience than someone else. But you might not be able to articulate that you've had experience with LIHTC properties, and that might be the type of property manager that we're looking for.
And I guess part of what I'm leading to is the fact that as part behind all of it, you're going to have for the reviewer, persons who are going to evaluate the submissions, you will have put in place an evaluation plan so they would know how they award the points that will be assigned to these specific factors, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
So with the list that you've got on the poll, and I know on the list of proposed core values, I know we are talking, or you've been talking about customer satisfaction as part of renewals. I guess I don't want to abandon that completely from even new contracts. And I appreciate, what you mentioned, the difficulty of, sort of doing apples to apples comparisons, essentially, if, looking at a vendor's record. And maybe it's not a quantitative component as much as it is with renewals, But I do encourage you to think about ways that, I don't want us to abandon that aspect for new hires, and whether it's part of the management plan or a separate, narrative about, how about their customer satisfaction and about, their record, and, being able to put it in context, I think is important. And, and also, whether there's a way for us to, to make sure that the needs of our customers are being captured and being reflected in the RFP.
Thank you. And we will, I think, of course, we're hearing this feedback. We can also look back to see if there's some other generic scoring that we could potentially utilize. I know we looked at that a little bit recently, but the team will go back and kind of evaluate how can we get some type of feedback in regards to customer service. Maybe we set a threshold. Maybe we also ask for an explanation on how they would continue to provide high level of customer service to our clients and what that looks like to them. So definitely taking the feedback from today's session in that regard.
I think
Or
one of,
maybe in their past performance, ask about their customer satisfaction, if they can provide that. Because to me, that would be, something that they should include, or at least I would as a potential customer, say, hey, my past performance included, customer service rankings or scores. I mean, maybe we could think about it there. Or you can.
Okay. Thank you.
I think another issue, there is much to be learned. It needs to be put in context, but going to the internet and looking at the comments of residents in other properties that they manage, and any comments that are made of our property and the management company as well. I looked at several and found some very shocking comments in some of these, and I think it would be useful for someone periodically to scan the internet comments made about our properties to see if we're missing something or insensitive to something. I think that could be periodically helpful.
Thank you.
This area we have not been addressed here, but it's partly in a way. That is the fact that we say, for example, on experience, we want to have, under the minimum qualifications thing, you get to have 3 or 5 years or whatever, the number you put in based upon the property or whatever it may be. But, so that would say, I'm a startup company. I've been in business for 1 year. I started my business, and I'm getting support from a number of different programs that are available to help new entrepreneurs and things like that. If I looked at this procurement, it would say to me, don't even bother about submitting a response unless you're going to consider doing a joint venture, perhaps with another more mature company that would get you past the experience numbers. And in fact, how would you count the subcontractor in terms of making an assessment about whether or not that company has presented as a joint venture has sufficient experience to even qualify under your minimum threshold?
I think you raise a great question that I'd love to get additional feedback from the commission. I mean, we weigh this element when we think about what type of experience we believe would be needed to provide the level of service to our properties. And when you do that and you weigh it against the number of years that a company has been in business, it is true that if a company is just getting started, they would not probably meet the initial criteria to provide property management to fill in the blank, cider mill, the Leggett, et cetera. And we recognize that that's a barrier to entry. And so thinking about how we balance that with also being and having a level of comfortability around a company's ability to provide the level of service that we need is a balance. I'd love to hear feedback from you all in regards to, are we weighing too heavily on wanting that demonstration of years of experience? They might not have a baseline. They might not have serviced clients in the past so that they don't have survey, or they might not have experienced what it's like to deal with an emergency during the winter storms because they haven't had that experience yet. Not to say that they couldn't step up to the plate and provide the level of service needed. And so this is an area that we've grappled with. Would love to hear thoughts from the commission. And then I think Commissioner Priest, you're right. You know, many times when you don't have experience, you look for opportunities to potentially partner to get that experience. But of course, you need a willing partner, and that might be difficult. So I'd love to hear the thoughts of the
We
commission.
certainly could look at the scale and size of the property in the context of, and whether they have a resource or whether we have the resource to back them up if we're trying to mentor or develop a pool of new people. What accessibility we could provide, what training we could provide, or direct them to grow in the job from maybe 10 units someplace to something bigger. And I think we should be cognizant of that, and particularly in the start of our own residents who may be wanting to start a business in a field that we are offering an RFP for. I think you have to make allowances if you're going to achieve that goal and support and nurture and improve opportunity. So that would be my take on it.
Thank
You
you.
know, one of the things we learned from experience is that you talk about the issue around diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that has made that unachievable has been the fact you always had these thresholds. You gotta have so much this or so much that. You gotta have a certain amount of knowledge, experience, capability. So as we think about moving forward, that we gotta think about how do we address that? How do we in our procurement consider those kinds of opportunities and things we want to provide? So it's just a broader question. It's not necessarily go to specifically ask me to refine this document. I'm just simply saying that's something that we've got to really grapple with.
No, I agree with you, and I think that maybe this language we might be able to come up with. Just like in a number of instances, you ask for somebody to have an educational background and have a master's or an equivalent. So we're looking for some maybe equivalent. If I think about 2 or 3 professionals who have worked for a medical firm for 10 years, and they decided to go out and form their own, and they had 20 projects for 1 year. Their suggestion could be that their combined 30 years worth of professional experience with this kind of work and 1 year experience at a firm sort of gets them to that minimum threshold. Now, we have obviously there is some subjectivity in terms of to what extent we accept that, but I think we should allow for some kind of equivalency to be established by the respondent.
Excellent feedback. Any other thoughts on that, on this point? Okay. Well, thank you all so much. We are at a point where we can take a quick break and then resume and focus in on scoring. And I defer to commissioners in terms of how long of a break would be appropriate. But maybe a 15, 20-minute break would be fine.
I believe we're close to the end of the scheduled time, and quite frankly, I don't feel like we're at a point where we should score anything yet, so should our break be until the next meeting?
Yeah.
Were you looking at the criteria for scoring? That's what you were talking about, right?
What we wanted to do was show you where the current scores are and how we've weighted, and if you go to slide 19, and then what and how we would propose allocating scoring. And so this was what this portion was about. And of course, if the desire is to not have this conversation, we can table it, but wanted an opportunity to get some initial reactions to the proposed scoring.
I'll defer to the rest of the committee, but I actually unfortunately have to jump away.
Thank you,
So,
Commissioner Markowitz. Have a great day.
I thought we were going to
Get a
one.
little hum in the background.
Yeah, I hear some feedback. Oh, that's better.
Chelsea, I haven't read the slides that follow, but it seems to me, having had the discussion we've had, which I think is divided up into a considerable amount of things to thought, it would be, I think this is productive for us to go back and ruminate on that discussion and also look at the information that is presented in the following slide. I mean, we can understand that material, we might have questions about it, but at least in terms of first glance, we can get a sense of where it's at, going, and begin to formulate questions. So it's a little bit of a disadvantage for us to see this stuff cold and have to respond. So my suggestion would be that we reserve the rest of it until the next meeting.
Thank you. If there's a, if that's the preference, you have the materials. What you might not, what I do want to make sure that you're able to understand is there are some areas in which where there may not be points reflected. You'll see that we have reflected that this is a threshold question, so no points instead of points. And let me see if there's any other area that might. And then you'll see where we've either proposed removing points compared to where we currently have them. And so hopefully the materials you see are clear enough, but of course we could answer any questions. And then I'll just move us to slide 21 that allows you an opportunity to see how we were proposing to continue this discussion. And so wanted an opportunity to give our best effort to demonstrate how we would propose moving forward with the RFP at today's session, hearing the feedback from the commissioners that allow us an opportunity to refine, coming back to the commissioners to work through getting in alignment, and then ultimately really putting the meat on the bones for the full procurement, the full RFP. So that's not something that would come before the commission. We would take the feedback we received here and create the RFP. Our goal also is at the beginning of the year to really try to attract additional business and to really try and encourage businesses who might not have worked with us in the past to have an opportunity to hear and preview what type of procurement opportunities there would be over the course of the year. We'd conduct a HOC procurement fair. And so the goal there is similar to what takes place in different cities and even our county, where you're able to present and have different divisions highlight the types of procurements that are typically ongoing, the annual type of procurements that are expected, so that companies who might not have engaged with us in the past have an opportunity to hear and know what that process is like, what to anticipate, how to get on our listserv so that they can receive notices when there's opportunity, and for us then also at the beginning of the year to roll out the new procurement for this RFP for property management. So we are in October. This is a couple of months until that point, so there's definitely an opportunity to take the feedback we've received here, to have the second session, and to take the questions that we receive in between now and then also to help inform the discussion.
I would thank you all very much for the presentation today and discussion. I would also encourage commissioners that as you all are reviewing what we discussed and providing comments, that you also include in that a review of the proposed scoring. It's just a matter of assigning points that says this is how we evaluate experience, for example, versus fees. And it's the right number of points to allocate. So if you've got comments on that, please provide them. Now, some of that may change by virtue of modifications that may be made in the document by virtue of our conversation today. That may change your weighing of how you would assign points. But we certainly can get into that. But if you have any comments about that right now, preliminarily, really feel free to share those with the staff and with each other as we go forward. So, any other comments the commission want to make before we end the discussion? Doesn't seem to be any, so I want to thank all the commission and the staff for participating in this conversation. I hope this is allowed to advance the discussion so that we can, in fact, have the next RFP that's issued for property management reflect our conversation and our, not a conversation, but our confirmation on how we want to proceed going forward with future RFPs for property management. I want to thank you all very much, and we consider this meeting over, adjourned.
Thank you, commissioners.